Hello everyone, welcome to my shop. Today I'm going to show you how I built these two shaker tables and I'll explain the missing drawer pull in the video. Let's get started. So I started off this project by milling the lumber for the legs, and you can see that first I'm getting a rough length here, and then I'll go ahead and rip them. Of course, if you start off with lumber that's thick enough, you won't have to mill it down and glue it back together like I am here. And also, if you don't have the tools for surfacing your lumber, you can simply get it pre-surfaced at the lumber yard. See, I took it to the jointer first, and that's to get a flat face and also one flat edge 90 degrees to that flat face, and then you can take it over to the planer and get a parallel face on the other end. And then lastly, you can rip it on your table saw and everything will be parallel and flat and equal to each other. Now I'm just gluing up my two pieces for my legs, and right here the be rough size here, and after the glue sets up I'll go back to the joiner and get another flat face and repeat the process. So it is a bit of work getting the lumber to where you want it, but you work with what you have and can make the best of it. And I think in my case I wanted about a 2-inch leg, so definitely wouldn't have anything that thick laying around. Some days my daughter likes to get out in the shop and work with me, and I certainly wouldn't turn down the help, that's for sure. So after these legs were milled up, I laid out for the mortises that will create the joinery for the table, and I definitely do not have the footage for that, and so it's going to jump to the mortises being done as well as the tenons. So in this shot here I'm just cleaning up on the edge here of these mortises, and we laid these out with a little bit of an offset. We used a router table with a spiral bit to cut these mortises. Here I set up a tapering jig to cut the taper on these legs, and basically these tapering jigs can be set up however you want them. You can either create them really adjustable, or in this case I screwed everything down, and you simply cut your first angle there and then rotate the leg to the appropriate position and cut through one more time. The trickiest part about cutting tapers is to make sure you're cutting the tapers on the right side of the legs. So what I did is laid them out in their positions they needed to be in and marked them appropriately. On the router table I put a 1/8 inch round over on all the corners. Next I began milling the aprons, and to be honest I had a rough sketch of this table and I wasn't sure how wide to make the aprons, so basically took a stab at it. I knew I wanted a 4-inch drawer, so I added 1 inch to either side and ended up with about a 6-inch apron. So unfortunately I don't have the video for these tenons either. We used a dado stack and a miter gauge on the table saw. Got really crisp shoulders using that method. I'm just rounding over the tenons here to match the mortises that we cut at the router table. Of course, I keep saying we. That's my Uncle Chuck and I. This is his shop here, and you'll see in the video I kind of go back and forth as I was building this project. And here I'm gluing up one of the tabletops. So now I'm putting a bevel on the top here and getting it to final size. Next, I worked on the drawer front opening. You could also create a mortise and tenon joint here. What I decided to do is use pocket hole jig. I'm trying to hit the center of the material, so I'm laying out for exactly where I want to line this up before I drill the holes. Now I'm preparing the bottom shelf for glue up, and I'm going to leave the lumber long. I won't know the exact dimensions until the table is dry fit together and I can get an accurate measurement. And I'm using biscuits for the joinery, and that's mainly just for the alignment of the faces. It doesn't provide much strength. It just helps later in the process when you start to sand. You won't have to worry about any extreme ridges or anything between your seams. I tend probably to maybe put too many clamps on, but rather than putting a lot of pressure on, I'd rather have even pressure throughout the glue up. After determining my final dimensions, I square one edge up and I rotate the board using the same reference point to cut it to final size. Now I'm laying out for the shelf mortise, and I believe they ended up being a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. Of course, the critical thing here is to make sure the legs are all laid out appropriately. Off camera, I cut one of these by hand with a chisel and a hammer, and I decided I didn't like that method, so I ended up going with a Forstner bit to get most of the waste for me. And I set up the stop on my drill press so it'll stop at my bottom line. So really I was just worrying about setting up from side to side. Even with most of the waste being cleared out, with my dull chisels, I still had fun cutting the rest of these out. Took a bit of work, but I eventually got there. This mortise here was a bit tight, a little squeaky, but eventually I got them. So now I'm doing a final dry fit with the shelf all set in place. It's really satisfying not to have any glue on these joints and for this table to hold together like it does. Next it was on to my least favorite thing of probably all woodworking, which is a whole lot of sanding, so just gotta take your time here. But for some reason my daughter said sanding is really fun, so I guess I know who to call when I need some sanding done. And on the glue up here, and This can be quite tricky, especially if you're using normal wood glue. Maybe a polyurethane glue or even a epoxy would work a lot better for you as far as working time and not being stressed out. But what I learned is the assembly that I'm putting on top there, you can glue those two up separately and then simply add the two aprons on either end to finish the whole assembly. And then lastly, I tried to make sure I got the glue squeeze out before it's set up. And here I'm using the drawer face for alignment for the drawer frame. And as I set it in place, I hold it with the clamps, and now I'm using the drill to drive in these pocket screws. One thing that's a little tricky about this is as you drive it in, the screw goes in on an angle and it tends to want to shift your piece that you're screwing into. So the way I set this up, the drawer face is pretty tight, but I make adjustments on the final piece. Then I started working on the drawer runners top and bottom, and I kind of just measured and put these in place one at a time. Of course, I had to notch around the legs on the inside to get the runner to fit in there nicely. Which brings me to my next point. Probably nothing more beautiful than the sound of a bandsaw. Right? Maybe not. So next I just checked the fit and then got ready for the glue up. Need just a little bit of material in here so the drawer can't slide into these corners. So I ripped a little piece here and now I'm gluing that in place. Next it was on to getting the material for the drawers ready, and I saved you from seeing all the milling again. This is about 1/2 inch lumber here now, and I bundled each side of the drawers together so they would be equal in length. So after these were prepared, I took them back to my Uncle Chuck's shop, and now you'll see me here running the Porter cable dovetail jig. And these are a bit fussy, but once you get them dialed in, you can just kind of go to town. And there's just a whole lot of setup to these. Some may consider it cheating, but to each his own. I believe if you can use the tools to your advantage and you have the knowledge of setting them up and using them, I think they're just as valuable. And the way I'm setting this up here is a through dovetail, but you could do half blinds and use your drawer face as part of the drawer. In my case, I made the drawers and then added the face later. And now I'm adding the slot for the bottom of the drawer. And on the pin side, you can run your slot completely through because the pins will be hidden. But on your dovetail side, you have to drop in and hide it behind the dovetail. Now on this setup, when you drop in, then you want to slowly make your way to the other end and have a reference point for where your bit is and stop accordingly. And now back in my shop, I'm cutting oak plywood for the bottom of the drawers. So now I have my drawer prepped for glue. One of the drawers I pre-finished, and this one here I decided to go ahead and glue up not finished. And my preference between the two is to definitely finish the piece on the inside before you glue up. So this was just a lot of fussing around, getting it all set in place, putting a few clamps on it, and the dovetails pretty much hold it in place itself, but this just ensures during the dry time that it doesn't come loose. And then you just want to make sure it's square when you're all said and done. So now it's on to staining, and I'm using a Gunstock Oak from Minwax, and I've used this in the past on another table, and I really love the color that it brings out in this wood. And I know a lot of woodworkers out there don't care for staining, but on this oak it just seems to make it really beautiful. And I let this dry for a few days, and then it was on to finishing, and I chose shellac here because it's alcohol based. It dries extremely fast and you can build coats pretty quickly. Only thing I've heard, not really experienced, is that it's not too durable, especially if you're going to have, say, a glass or something that may be wet on top of the table. And we'll see what happens. If it doesn't hold up, I'll put a coat of poly on top. So I chose figure 8 clips to attach the top, and it's kind of my first time using these, and I know they're important along the width because that's where your expansion is, but I also added them on the two ends as well, so we'll see how that works out for me. So far so good. After carefully placing the top in place and clamping it down, I was ready to screw the figure 8s to the top. After pre-drilling, it was pretty easy to cinch them up in there. So then it was time to go through the grits and finish up the drawer. Just throw some tunes on and get to work, I guess. And of course, everything you see here I did ×2. So I had lots of fun sanding. And back to staining and then adding finish. Now, I've seen other woodworkers cut their shellac with denatured alcohol to thin it out, especially in the first couple coats, and it kind of gives it a really smooth base. But I'm taking it straight out of the can here, so it is a little bit thicker, I guess. You can see in your coats as you go along. Now I'm just fitting the drawer front here, and one trick my Uncle Chuck taught me here is to fill the gap on one end completely with cards and then split the difference on either end after you get the total number of cards. So lastly, I installed the drawer pull I did have, and no mystery really. I just lost the drawer pull after I finished it, and I only have one. Anyway, thanks for watching.